What follows is a radio phone-in on a matter regarding the National Trust, who are a heritage conservation charity in the UK, and they included an exhibit about creationism in their visitor centre for the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. Richard Dawkins is the guest. The link to the whole phone-in is in the description. Here's a chap who phoned in and got rather emotional, culminating in the usual trick of threatening Richard Dawkins with meeting a maker in which Dawkins doesn't believe.
Hello, Linda. So, I was listening to Richard Dawkins there speaking, and he referred to me as being a nutcase.
Well, not personally.
Not personally, but in general. He's referring to a Christian, born or a creationist, so call him whatever you like, and that I'm a nutcase.
All right, I take back nutcase. I will just say ignorant. It's no crime being ignorant. You're not a nutcase, but if you are a young Earth creationist, I'm sorry to say so, you're ignorant.
Mr. Richard Dawkins, apologise to me on air that I am not a nutcase.
I've apologised to you. You're not a nutcase. You are ignorant.
Oh, I'm ignorant now?
Yes.
Well, sir, will I tell you something? One day you'll bend the knee just like everybody else before you're there. I have no more time to talk to you, sir.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Same to you.
Next, we move on to housewife Mrs. White, who tells us she has looked at all the evidence.
Mrs. White has called in about this. Hello, Mrs. White.
Hello, good afternoon, Wendy. Yes, I'd like to say Professor Dawkins, as usual, engages in ad hominem attacks against Christians. So he's now...
Not Christians, creationists.
I'm Christian and I'm a creationist, sir.
But the two aren't necessarily the same, are they?
As far as I'm concerned, they are.
Well, they are in your case, but in other people's cases, we heard from Ken, who, for instance, who didn't agree.
I'd just like to say that Professor Dawkins has stated no reputable scientist believes in a young Earth and creation. That is a blatant lie. I can name 4, and he knows one of them. Professor Andy McIntosh,
oh, for God's
Professor Edgar Andrews, Dr. Steve Lloyd, and Mr. Paul Garner. All Christians, all young Earth creationists, and all reputable scientists, sir.
Well, okay, I know the first 2. I don't know the second 2. And all I can say is that we can't do it by numbers, but if you actually count up the numbers of scientists, you'll find it's a tiny, tiny minority. But never mind about counting numbers. Just go and look at the evidence. It's overwhelmingly convincing. I'm pretty sure you've never looked at it. May I please encourage you to do so?
Well, though Richard Dawkins had only heard of the first 2, did you hear the tortured groan at the mention of Andy McIntosh? I think he missed a trick by not pointing out what their qualifications are. So let's see what we can find out about Mrs. White's scientists. Professor Andy McIntosh is indeed a scientist and a professor. But of what? He's a professor of thermodynamics and combustion, an expert in chemistry. In other words, no more qualified to speak with authority than anyone else on biology, geology, astronomy or paleontology, the main branches of science that proves evolution and/or an old Earth. Professor Edgar Andrews is another interesting case. He is Professor of Materials, an expert in the science of large molecules, and has a degree in theoretical physics. Again, a bona fide scientist, but not in any of the fields relevant to the age of the Earth or biology. He's written a book, Who Made God? You may find it necessary to pause on the next few slides if you want to read them. The write-up says he's not a Christian, yet, according to the link on the right-hand side, he talks about the spare rib. He supports Genesis, as we can see. Figure that one out. Anyhow, follow this link, and he cites how scientists have concluded that all living human males have a common ancestor going back 59,000 years, and all living females have a common ancestor going back 143,000 years, and then makes the astonishing claim that a race of subhumans lived for 84,000 years. This is a man with qualifications, yet he attributes creationist values to evolution, i.e. that humans, both male and female, should instantly pop into existence at the same time out of nothing. Somebody left a comment and corrected his total misunderstanding of the findings. Somebody else made a counter comment, Then Andrews himself chipped in, stating that he did not understand the objection. That says it all. He just doesn't understand evolution, so he is not qualified to object to it. Well, that's enough of him, and now on to the two who Richard Dawkins had never heard of. Well, I can't say I'm surprised that he hasn't heard of these two. Dr. Steve Lloyd of Biblical Creation Ministries is a former research scientist and has a doctorate in material science, i.e. again a qualification, but totally irrelevant to the so-called controversy. He shows his ignorance on evolution, as he doesn't know it is concerned only with speciation and not about how life first started, as is demonstrated by a Channel 4 page, whereby a number of people are asked to briefly air their views on a specific topic. In this case, the topic is it possible to believe in God and Darwin? The link is in the description. Incidentally, here is a brief resume regards the others that you see featured here. Dr. Sandra Fourier doesn't believe that you can believe in both. And her profession? A vet. Simon Watt is an evolutionary biologist. Dr. Alistair Noble doesn't believe that you can believe in both. And his profession? A researcher in chemistry. Alana Maltby is an evolutionary biologist and an atheist. Dr. Ruth Bankiewicz, a biologist and a Christian, she supports evolution and dismisses the young earth. So obviously she thinks that Darwin and God are compatible. Alinga Tazib, he is a Baha'i and a student of physics and philosophy and supports evolution and dismisses the young earth. Of the ones who think that evolution and God are mutually exclusive, they have qualifications that have nothing to do with any of the relevant branches of science. And to be fair, the same goes for Alinga Tazib. And finally, we have Paul Garner of Biblical Creation Ministries. While the previous three have scientific qualifications, albeit not relevant, I can't find any qualifications for Paul Garner at all. But he has written a book. It's called The New Creationism, and it can be purchased via eden.co.uk, who describe themselves as a world of Christian resources and the UK's #1 online Christian store. Yet interestingly, even in this microcosm of book sales, Garner's book is their 10,081st bestseller. That's the 10,081st bestseller on the #1 online Christian seller. Enough said on this, scientist. So, Mrs. White, it's not a case of black and white with the names you've provided, but more of a murky shade of grey.
How have you looked at the evidence, Mrs. White? Have you read any of the books about the world being created, other than the Bible?
Yes, we have. We are members of the Biblical Creation Society, of which Professor Edgar Andrews is the chairman. And they go into these matters in great detail. They research themselves, and they are reputable scientists.